Yep, we're good. All right.
So I'm Zane Grabau, nematologist at the University of Florida. I'm going to be talking today about cover crops and plant-parasitic nematode management. Oh. A little bit of a delay. So the main points I'm going to talking about today, I want to kind of give you some take-home points so that if you don't catch everything in the talk, you have a few things hopefully you'll take away from the talk. So also kind of serves as an outline of what I'm going to be talking about. So point one, there are different types of nematodes, and it's important to know having a general understanding of what they are, because it matters for cover crop management. Number two, nematode management is a continual process. Basically, I'm going to get into some of the details of why cover crops may help with nematode management. And then number three, cover crop efficacy varies by your combination of nematodes and what cover crop you're considering. So first I'm going to talk about different types of nematodes, just kind of a review. So first one, most people are probably familiar with root knot nematodes. I guess I have up here row crops, going to be focusing mostly on row crops. This is a picture of a female root knot nematode excised from a root. And the classic symptoms of root knot nematode on cotton and soybean, you've got galling from root knot nematode. That's a classic symptom. And then in the field, this is a peanut field with classic symptoms of root knot nematode, just patches of chlorosis, yellowing, and death from that peanut root knot nematode infecting those plants. So root knot nematodes, most crops are affected by them. They are widespread and damaging, kind of like I illustrated in the last slide. And it's not quite as simple as just saying root knot nematodes, because we've got a few different species and the infection varies by species crop combination. I've got a little table here to kind of summarize it, but basically the major ones we're looking at in the southeast are southern root knot nematode, which is mainly a problem on cotton, but also infects corn and soybean. And then two species that affect peanut root knot nematode and javanica, Meloidogyne javanica, are problems on peanut. And then I also mentioned guava root knot nematode because it's been an emerging problem, especially in North Carolina. A little bit less known about this nematode, but what we know so far is that soybean is likely a host and cotton tends to be a host, although it seems to vary a little bit by what population you have of the guava root knot nematode. So again, there's different species of root knot nematode, and depending on what species you have, it's going to affect different crops. So second nematode we deal with in the southeast, sting nematode. This is a problem on most row crops, but it tends to be worst on grasses. So corn is kind of our primary cash crop that it becomes a big problem on. And the host range is going to vary a little bit based on population. You have some populations that may go to peanut, for instance, and some may go to cotton and so forth. Tends to be a problem in very sandy soil, which is in Florida is basically all of our soils, but something like 90% sand or more is where this nematode is going to do the best. Because of that restriction to very sandy soils, it's a little bit more localized than a root knot nematode, but it's very damaging where it's present. Here's a picture from a field trial in corn. On the left, you have severe stunting from sting nematode, untreated without any nematicide. On the right is a fumigated plot where you've got less damage from the sting nematode. And then just illustration of some of the symptoms on the roots, severe stunting and pruning from that nematode. And then the third major nematode would be reniform nematode. Here's a picture of reniform nematode females and egg masses on a cotton root. This one affects primarily cotton. It also can infect soybean as well, but it's a little bit less damaging on that one. In contrast to the other nematodes, it has relatively subtle symptoms, even though it may be draining a little bit of your yield. Here's an illustration in the field. The center 2 rows here are unfumigated, and you see a little bit more wilting and some stunting from that reniform nematode compared to the outer rows, which are fumigated. In contrast to sting nematode, this one can do pretty well in heavier soils. Some publications have put it about 80% sand is the optimal rate for this one. There are a number of other nematodes in row crops, but these are kind of the major ones. And every time I go through symptoms and things of the different nematodes, I always kind of reiterate sampling is the best way to confirm if you have a nematode problem. I don't expect people to remember, oh, this is this exact symptom of this nematode and so forth. But the idea is that have some familiarity with what the symptoms might be so you know when to go ahead and sample. Some of the things to keep in mind with sampling, I say we always want to get soil samples because some of the nematodes we're not able to pick up in the roots, but all of the nematodes we should be able to get from the soil. And when you're collecting those samples, remember to prevent heating and drying of them. Supplementing with pictures and root samples is also good. Kind of specific for Florida, Nematode Assay Lab here does run samples for extension agents for free. So that's the end of kind of your introduction overview of the different types of nematodes that can kind of set us up for the rest of the presentation. So the second point that I'm going to be talking about, nematode management is a continual process. Again, getting to kind of some of the why of or how cover crops may help manage nematodes. So first, just a little bit of the concepts of managing nematodes. What are our goals? So in general, what we're looking to do is reduce populations of nematodes in the soil. The idea is that you have fewer nematodes, you're going to get less damage when you do have to grow a crop that is susceptible to whatever nematodes you have in the field. And our tools of doing this are generally crop rotation with our cash crops, cover crops, and then also nematicide applications give us a temporary reduction in our nematode populations. Eradication is not a feasible goal for nematode management once we have them in the field. So this is just some data illustrating population reduction, increasing yield. So you have peanut yield on the y-axis here, and then on the x-axis is the root knot nematode population. So you're seeing a decrease in the pod yield as the initial root knot nematode populations increase. So kind of a second concept that's used in management is escape prevention. Some examples of this would be using a resistant cultivar, quarantining to try to prevent moving nematodes from one field to another. One of the reasons I bring up these different strategies is that with nematode management, it's best to try to integrate your different strategies. Cover crops may be one piece of it, but it's important to know that you have other options as well. In particular, because as we've been talking about today, you may have multiple different reasons you want to put out a cover crop, and it may be that you have a particular cover crop that you want to put out that maybe doesn't work quite as well with your nematode management plan. So in that case, it's important to pull in other pieces such as rotation with your cash crops or use of a nematicide to supplement what you may not be able to do with your cover crop. So ways that cover crops can reduce nematode abundances. First of all, and the main way that cover crops are going to work is through a non-host or a poor host effect. So basically, whatever nematode you have in the field doesn't feed on your cover crop. The nematode has no food, so the populations are going to decline. And again, as I said before, this is going to vary based on what nematode you have in the field and what crop you're looking to grow. Not every crop is a non-host for every nematode. The second way that cover crops may work is that they may have some nematicidal compounds in it that are going to directly kill your nematodes. I mentioned here, for it to be fully effective, obviously you're going to want it, this whatever cover crop that has the nematicide to also be a non-host. Otherwise, you're kind of working at cross purposes. And there's other mechanisms as well, but those are kind of the main ones that you need to know about to follow the rest of the presentation. Of course, not every cover crop is going to perform each function. So looking specifically at non-host cover crop, some of the keys to success. First of all, the longer time that you're growing a non-host, the more benefits that you're going to have. This you can think of this either in terms of continuously growing a cover crop. So something like a, if you're growing like a bahia grass where you're growing it for 2 years, you're going to have more benefit than if you're just growing a winter cover crop or a short summer cover crop. The other thing is that you're likely to get more benefits repeating this practice yearly over time than you are just doing it as a one-off. Another thing to keep in mind is that nematodes tend to increase most, they reproduce most when it's hotter. So the practical point with this is that in the summer, and if there's a warm winter as well, it's going to be more critical for your nematode management to be having a non-host out there. If you have a cold winter, it may be slightly less critical in terms of nematode control, what cover crop you have out there, because there's just not going to be as much nematode reproduction. Of course, it's difficult to predict whether you're going to have a warm winter or a cold one. Another concept to keep in mind is that weeds can also host nematodes. So if your cover crop is doing well at managing weeds, it can be an added benefit for helping with your nematodes, versus if you have a really weedy cover crop that isn't controlling your weeds as well, you may not be getting as much benefit as you would like. And then mixtures, we talked a little bit about this as well before. Obviously, there's benefits for different things. For nematodes, it kind of introduces a little bit more variability. If you have all non-hosts in your mixture, of course, it's going to be the same as planting not just one non-host. If you have a mixture, it's going to be a little bit more unpredictable. And of course, the worst case scenario is if you're going to pick all hosts. So, and then a little bit more about cover crops with nematicidal effects. So this is just a table of some selected cover crops that may have nematicidal effects. So some of them are sun hemp, brassicas such as carinata, radish, and so forth. Marigold, rye does have some. And I mentioned here that the strength of evidence for whether these compounds are actually nematicidal, especially in the field, tends to vary. For some of them, like the brassicas and the marigold, it's pretty strong that we can get a nematicidal effect. For others, rye and sun hemp, I kind of classified it as somewhat moderate as to whether these compounds are actually providing nematicidal effect in the field. So in this slide, I say nematicidal effects from cover crops, definitely not a magic bullet. There's differences between knowing that a crop contains compounds that may be nematicidal in the field or in the lab versus how well it actually performs in the field. And then also your activity and content is going to vary by crop or cultivar. You're going to get the most activity if a cover crop does have nematicidal compounds in it, if you're able to till in the fresh biomass and incorporate those potentially nematicidal compounds into the soil. Whereas if you're growing it until it's dry, you're not as likely to get as much impact. And then of course, what really matters in the end is how well the cover crop manages the nematodes, regardless of what the mechanism is. So we went through bullet number 2 onto the last point. Cover crop efficacy varies by nematode and cover crop combination. So I'm going to kind of go through for each nematode just some examples of crops that may be good or bad for that particular nematode. So looking at some of our major root knot nematodes, I've lumped southern root knot nematode and peanut root knot nematode into a table together because they, the cover crops have tended to perform similarly for these two nematodes based on the literature. So what I have here are kind of 3 different categories. Avoid, these are very good hosts of root knot nematodes. And then the yellow here, they're okay. They may be a moderate host. It may depend on what cultivar you select. The literature may be a little bit divided there. And then ones that, based on the literature, are pretty good choices. We know pretty well that they're a poor or non-host pretty consistently for the cultivars that are available. So for root knot nematodes, and then I've got it divided by winter cover crops and summer cover crops. So in general, for root knot nematodes, most legumes tend to be hosts for root knot nematodes. So things like hairy vetch and most clover are under the list of ones that you probably want to avoid. Cowpea under under summer cover crops. And then kind of in the middle, we have oats, rye, wheat, sesame. Things like this are maybe okay depending on what cultivar you have. And then under ones that tend to be a good choice, Bahia grass. There are some resistant varieties of clover to at least to some species of root knot nematode. And then most of our best cover crops for root knot nematodes are summer cover crops. Sun hemp overall tends to be our best and most consistent cover crop for managing a variety of nematodes. And then sorghum Sudan grass. And there's some resistant cultivars of cowpea, especially for southern root knot nematode. So just mixing a little bit of data here so I don't overwhelm you with tables, but this is some data from a field study by Timper et al. Looking at cotton production after growing various winter cover crops. So they looked at vetch and various vetch cover crops as well as rye and fallow. And this is illustrating on the left here gall index. So basically a higher index indicates more galling. And then they saw significantly more galling on the cotton following hairy vetch or early vetch winter cover crops than on some of the other treatments. And the yield was also lower following the hairy or early vetch. So looking at sting nematode. So again, I've got these divided up into kind of avoid and good choices. There's less known for sting nematode as far as how some of the common cover crops are affected by sting nematode. But the biggest takeaway from this is to avoid grasses. These are the best hosts for sting nematodes. If you have a rotation that's heavy on grasses, such as a situation where you're getting into corn monoculture, it's going to really increase your sting nematode populations. And if you're able to break up that grass monoculture with your cover crops, it's likely to help managing with this particular nematode. So example for sting nematode is a fall or late summer cover crop trial that I've been involved in. We looked at sun hemp, corn, pearl millet, and sorghum Sudan grass. And this is just illustrating some of the symptoms we saw in corn grown after these fall cover crops. This was targeting silage corn in like a dairy operation. And then the center here, you can see stunted corn roots following some of our grasses, sorghum and corn, and our fertilized millet. And then the outside are following sun hemp, and we just have a much more vigorous root system. And that's one of the main symptoms of sting nematode, is just stunting of the roots. As far as the actual data, this is right before planting corn in the spring, sting nematode populations. And when we used corn as our cover or rotation crop, we had much higher populations versus looking at our sun hemp tend to be our best crop for managing that nematode. And the corn yield, not significantly different among our different treatments, but definitely numeric trend to be greater with our following our sun hemp treatment. So last, reniform nematode. And the guidance for this is relatively similar to what we saw for root knot nematode. Again, the legumes tend to be hosts of reniform nematodes, so they're ones to avoid if you're having trouble with reniform nematode. Things that tend to be a little bit better, or among our best choices, at least based on our initial data, Carinata seems to be good, Bahia grass, and most of our grasses tend to be non-hosts and work well for managing reniform. And again, summer cover crops, sun hemp is a good one, and sorghum Sudan grass is also a non-host. So I'm going to kind of skip through this because Andy already went over this. But again, to briefly reiterate, we had a field study out at Quincy where they have set up winter and summer cover and summer crops, and we found that fallow tended to have the most reniform nematodes versus either a rotation between Carinata and fallow or an oats Carinata 2-year rotation. So again, main points, there are different types of nematodes. And again, sampling is going to help you determine which nematodes you have. That's going to allow you to pick what cover crop is going to be best for your situation. Nematode management is a continual process. And again, cover crop efficacy varies by nematode and cover crop combination. So I don't know, we have time for questions or not, but certainly want to acknowledge collaborators on the that corn project and also the Carinata rotation project as well.